Hey guys, welcome back. Eric Smith here, contributor on 5 Reasons Sports, also co-host of Scouting the Fins. And in today's video, we're going to kind of work through a 32-team, 7-round mock draft that I'm participating in. In the past, I have participated in a 3-round mock draft where every team was represented by an actual person, and it was a lot of fun because it was a slower pace, more of a true GM feel as people were going off the board. Like you really felt the pressure to, possibly look into moving up or start reevaluating your plan. Like I said, in this mock draft, every team is going to be represented by an actual person, so they're going to be making picks really based on what they feel is specific to that team. When I do computer simulations, and I've done plenty of those, they move much faster. There's very little emotion involved in the players that are going off the board. And I really don't like to do trades on there because the teams are not represented by individuals who have those other teams' best interest in mind. With this live mock draft format, I will entertain more trades. I'm not going to look to, trade multiple times up and down. I'm not going to look to acquire 20 picks. So it's going to be pretty reasonable, I feel, but we'll entertain it more than the computer simulated ones. This draft also allows player trades, and you'll probably see some of those as we go through the picks and look at the picks that are coming off the board. Not something I'm really going to get into, even though somebody like Tyreek might be, in consideration for something like that. And I think that as far as trades, right, when I say reasonable, I think there are certain times where you can kind of expect a team to do something. And, I refer back to 2024, and I forget what the gap was after the Patrick Paul pick, but there was a pretty big gap before the Dolphins' next pick. And I know leading up to the draft, I was predicting they would move back up into the third round and try to recoup that pick. They didn't do that, but they did move back up into the fourth round using a 2025 third round pick. And I think we kind of have something similar this year with the gap between picks 48 and 98. So that is something that I am going into the draft looking for an opportunity to move up from 98. Ideally, I would find a scenario, since that is a comp pick, I would like to use the fourth round comp pick that we got for Christian Wilkins and be able to package those two together. Ideally, I'm looking to get back up into, maybe the mid 80s. I just feel there's going to be a lot of talent still available there, but not something I'm going to do ahead of the draft. That's going to be something that I look at as the draft is moving on, and then see if I can find a trade partner if guys that I like are falling. Part of doing a format like this, before the draft, really need to assess where the roster stands today, and that's what we're going to start with before we get into the draft. All right, we're going to take a look at the offense first, and we're going to go in order here of what we have on the screen. So the wide receivers are what we're going to look at first, where the only real addition to the room was Nick Westbrook-Ikhine. And whether you see him as the number 3 receiver or you see Malik Washington as the number 3 with Westbrook-Ikhine as the number 4, whoever Westbrook-Ikhine replaced as that fourth body in that room is a significant upgrade. He brings a physicality to the room that didn't exist. He wants to get involved in the run game, which is something that, we definitely miss with both Waddle and Hill. Washington is more willing, but the body just isn't there for him. Westbrook-Ikhine has that willingness, has the body. In terms of other bodies in the room, you got Ezukanma, who the team is clearly, still, I don't know if they're high on him, but they're still giving him a chance. And you got Taj Washington returning from an injury, who was a draft pick last year. So as we enter into this mock draft, wide receiver room is not something I'm actively looking to add a significant body to. But if the opportunity presents itself, especially on day 3 of these picks, I would look at options there. But I'm pretty happy with where that room is today. And then as we get into the offensive line room, so we know that Teron Armstead, his future is still unclear, but the team does have Patrick Paul waiting in the wings. And me personally, I have no issues with him moving over and taking that spot. We know that James Daniels was the headliner of the offensive line room in terms of additions. I do feel that his best position is right guard, but if there is an opportunity to add a right guard in the draft, I think he's got the flexibility to be able to move over to the left side. We still have Liam Eichenberg listed as a starter. Don't want to see him in the starting lineup, and I don't feel that he is a great fit on the left side. We also brought in Larry Borum, who right now is listed as a swing tackle, but I think that his best position in this offense is going to be left guard. So I'd like to see him compete for that position, especially if it is Liam. But not thrilled about him as a swing tackle, but that's where he is today. Have Keon Smith kind of waiting in the wings there as the ideal swing tackle, but he's obviously got experience and health issues returning from injury here. In a perfect world, I would prefer to see a veteran that is better than Larry Borum at tackle signed to be that swing tackle option. But at the same time, on the Scouting the Fins podcast, I talked about cornerbacks and how I can never have enough number one cornerbacks, and I would never shy away from drafting one of those. I kind of feel the same way about offensive tackle, that I never feel that you can really have enough of those guys. So if the opportunity presents itself for an offensive tackle, even though I'm comfortable with Teron Armstead and Austin Jackson, I would still consider that. If you have 4 offensive tackles and need 1 guard, then I feel like you can, find a way to make that work. So going into the draft, right, if there is a perfect opportunity at left guard, I wouldn't hesitate to take that. But going to look to add something to this room, and if it's not a left guard, probably going to be more of a tackle type that could develop as a tackle, but has position flexibility as well. Moving on to the tight end room. So kind of the same from last year. We got Jonnu Smith returning, Julian Hill is returning, and then you have Pharaoh Brown replacing Durham Smythe. So I do think that Pharaoh Brown is an upgrade over Durham Smythe. Not sure that he is going to be able to jump Julian Hill. I think Julian Hill offers more of a higher ceiling as a blocker, whereas Pharaoh Brown is a little more consistent right now. So I think those two are very much the same type of players. And then I think that, Jonnu is that F tight end, move tight end, right? We have Tanner Connor there, but that's been a project we've been doing for a while and really haven't seen many returns on it. So, again, I expect Jonnu Smith to play a high number of snaps, but if we could find an opportunity to find a rookie in a similar type mold that could, back up Jonnu as that F position tight end and maybe develop into a player that would allow us to move off of Jonnu, that's something that I'm going to be keeping an eye out for in the draft as well. Looking at the quarterback position, like it or not, we all know that Tua is entrenched as the starter. Zach Wilson was brought in as the backup. I don't feel the room got worse, but I don't know that it really got better for 2025. And the reason that I say that is, do you really feel like if Tua goes on, a 4-game IR stint, does Zach Wilson give you a better chance to win more than 1 game in that stretch than Tyler Huntley did? And for me, right now, I can't say that he does. What Zach Wilson does offer is a little more future upside, right? Maybe he comes in and he does really well in this system and he is can be used as trade bait in the future. Or maybe Tua gets injured again. And I know we're really shooting for the stars here, but maybe Zach Wilson comes in and shows that he's competent enough that the team has the flexibility to move off of Tua in the future without spending a significant draft pick. Like I said, that's kind of shooting for the stars, but that's the only way that I see that the position could be considered upgraded over what there was in 2024 when we look at Zach Wilson moving into that spot. And then last position for offense, looking at the running back room, I haven't even looked at fullbacks. Alec Ingold is obviously your fullback one, not looking to change anything there. Would be more of a late seventh round pick or a UDFA in terms of somebody to, maybe look to compete there. I think that Julian Hill is kind of a ideal type backup for Alec Ingold, just in terms of if we need somebody to step into that role on game day. Now, as far as running backs, we added Alexander Madison. Raheem Mostert has swapped places and gone to the Raiders, and we also subtracted Jeff Wilson to the room. I think he's still unsigned, but when I look at what I would consider for this room, I think they really want Devon Achane and Jalen Wright to be that 1-2 punch. And I think that Madison really reminds me of Jalen Wright. So I see him kind of as a mentor, see those two as playing the same type of true running back positions. But what is missing in this room for me is, what if something happens to Devon Achane? Who else can do the stuff that he does? And it's not Jalen Wright. It's not Alexander Madison. So in terms of the draft, things that I'm going to keep an eye on is an opportunity to find a similar player to Devon Achane. Then if we do, lose him for a period of the season, that we don't have to scrap that portion of the offense and we can continue on. So that's my opinion of the offense and maybe some of the areas that I'm going to look at as we go through this mock draft. All right, as we move to the defensive side, so defensive line, right? You know that Zach Sealer is going to be the focal point of that defensive line still. And they brought back Benito Jones, who plays an important role, but not a huge snap count role. And then you have a couple of really end of the roster type guys. Would not be surprised at all to see these guys not part of the 53 when cut day comes. So this room is certainly incomplete. And this is probably one of the more significant positions that I'll be looking to add somebody in the draft. Nice part with this is that there's a lot of flexibility in terms of the types of players that you can add, right? You can have Benito Jones in there with Sealer on early downs and get more of a one-gap penetrator type player, or you can, have somebody that's a little more versatile and have that player and Zach Sealer in there together and just kind of spell them with Benito Jones. The base defense, and we've heard some of the free agents talking about this in their interviews, is it's a 3-4 defense. So probably looking for somebody that can, is not just a nose tackle type, can really fill that 5 technique position opposite Zach Sealer with Benito Jones at nose tackle. But, we'll just kind of have to see what is available come draft time. But this is certainly a position to keep an eye on. And then as we look at the edge positions, right, so this is going to be your outside linebacker positions. Big thing here is that you got Jalen Phillips and Bradley Chubb returning from injury. So the position already, without doing anything free agency or draft-wise, should be significantly better. You've got Chop Robinson, which, if everybody is healthy, and we all know that that's not a likely scenario, but if all three are healthy, you're looking to have one of the best top 3 edge groups in the NFL. They also returned Quentin Bell, who is a solid role type player, not a player that you want to see starting all season, but can play some important snaps and also a special teams guy. You're going to have Mo Kamara going into his second year and hopefully can continue to find his niche in the offense. Cam Good is another player who gave us some good snaps. Grayson Murphy is a player they liked a lot before the injury. So you can see that this room is not only stacked with talent, but also depth. So not a position that I'm really going to be looking at adding much in the draft. If a player falls into day 3 and it's just a best player available type deal, not going to shy away from it, but not something I'm actively looking to add. And then the inside linebacker room. So Jordan Brooks was obviously one of the stars of the defense last year. And then we returned Tyrell Dodson, right? So that kind of allows you to be status quo going from one year to the next. You add KJ Britt, who is a similar player to Anthony Walker. My opinion is that, I could see him competing with Tyrell Dodson for those early down snaps. Does Dodson probably still win out in terms of a 3-down linebacker? Yeah. But KJ Britt is a really good 2-down player, kind of in that Landon Roberts mold. They also added Willie Gay Jr., who is basically the opposite of KJ Britt. I don't want Willie Gay Jr. in there on first down or, third and short scenarios. But I don't want KJ Britt in coverage. So those two are going to complement each other well, right? And I wouldn't be surprised to see them kind of take snaps from Tyrell Dodson, and the combination of Britt and Gay kind of turn into that linebacker number 2. So with the additions in that room, no matter how those three sort out, I think the room is fairly complete. But again, I wouldn't shy away from adding somebody that could be an upgrade. I'm probably not going to look at a round 1 or 2 guy there, but I like where that position is as of today. And let's jump to safety here. So the safety room, right, they added Afatu Melifonwu, and they added Ashton Davis. And I think it's going to be hard not to see those two as an upgrade over Holland and Poyer, especially based on the way they looked in 2024. You've also got Patrick McMorris, who the team was very high on. And then you got Elijah Campbell, who played some significant snaps last year that returned in free agency as well. So this room here, I wouldn't say it's set, but I think they did a good job of upgrading from what they had in 2024, especially if Melifonwu can stay healthy. Ashton Davis, didn't really like how the Jets used him in his time there. I think that in the Ravens style defense, in the Dolphins style defense, it provides an opportunity for a deep center fielder type player. And that's how I saw Ashton Davis coming out in the draft. And I think that's a position that he could play well for the Dolphins. I kind of saw McMorris the same way, so it'll be interesting to see those two competing for that starting free safety spot. But I like whoever comes out of that. I think it's 2 good options, but there is still room to add somebody else to this room, especially if it's an impact type player in a defense that allows you to get 3 safeties on the field at the same time. You're not throwing away a free agency signing if you bring in a top safety in the draft. And then cornerback room, similar to defensive line, is probably one of the most glaring rooms that need additions here. You have Jalen Ramsey, who is clearly starter, probably your number 1 corner, with some rare exceptions. Kader Kohou is in your top 3. You feel okay if he's your number 2 corner, probably not great. Would prefer to see him as your number 3. And then after that, you have a whole lot of, you don't know what it is. You got Storm Duck, you got Cam Smith, you got the, Ethan Bonner, Isaiah Johnson, somebody that a lot of people liked, right? But you really don't feel comfortable going into 2025 with any of those guys as your top option for the number 3 cornerback. So incomplete room here. This is probably another room that I'm going to look to add somebody fairly high in the draft that can play right away. All right, so let's get into the draft. Obviously not going to make you guys sit through it. We're going to go through fairly quick the other picks that were made. You can see that Travis Hunter went number 1 overall. You had Cam Ward going 2 to the Browns, Carter going to the Giants. Saw the Saints coming up to get Shadur Sanders, so glad we don't have to talk about that conversation. Mason Graham to the Jaguars. Shamar Stewart was a little bit of a surprise to me going to the Raiders. Had Kenneth Grant going to the Jets. Another one that I like Kenneth Grant as a player, but not really a player I would have been excited about at 13. So kind of glad to see him go earlier, so I didn't really have to get into that conversation. Will Johnson's probably the first player that I would have probably had at the top of my list for 13 if he was there. I don't expect him to be there. So kind of disappointed he went there, but plenty of good options left based on what happened ahead of that. Will Campbell, another player that we fully expect to be gone by 13. Membu, another one that I like Membu. I don't know that I like him at 13, so not disappointed to see him go, so I don't have to talk about that one. Mike Green, very talented, some off the field concerns. And then the last pick before the Dolphins pick was Ashton Genty. That's a player I would have considered, and I would have, really gotten into the reasons behind it. But he went at 12, not something that we have to talk about. All right, so talking about the Dolphins pick at 13, this really came down to three players that I was looking at strongly. And those are Jahdae Barron, Tyler Warren, Malachi Starks. All three very different players in terms of what they bring to the defense. Barron is a player that, I like the way that Texas moved him around, able to play in the slot, able to play on the boundary, able to play some safety stuff as well. Really reminds me of Jalen Ramsey. Um, Definitely an upgrade to the cornerback room. And then we look at Tyler Warren, who is the one clear upgrade at the Y tight end position. I do like Mason Taylor a lot, but there's a big gap between Warren and Taylor for me. That's a player that could step in, going to improve the run game from day one over what Julian Hill and Durham Smythe offered. Is going to be a much better receiver than those guys. And isn't just limited to that. He can move around. He can do that wildcat stuff. He can, run the ball here and there for the Dolphins. Really brings a lot of versatility, and there's room in this offense, as we saw last year, to have a Y tight end and still have Jonnu Smith as that F tight end, and both of them playing well over 500 snaps. So I wouldn't rule it out based on Jonnu Smith being on the roster. But like I said earlier, I think that's a position that was at least somewhat upgraded over some of the other options we'll talk about. And then Malachi Starks is the third one. I've talked about him before. Did I see him in the same light as like the Creed Humphrey type deal, where had a really good season 2 years ago, was viewed as a top prospect, a can't miss type guy, and then has kind of gotten picked apart through this draft process. And, it worked out well for the Chiefs. They got Creed Humphrey, and he's one of the best centers in the league. I kind of see Starks going down the same road there. I think he's a player that has a lot of versatility, can play deep, can play down the box. I think that when you look at the safeties that were added, I still think that this is a player that you can get on the field, you can move him around, and you're not taking anything away from the guys that you've already added. All right, so my pick ended up being Jahdae Barron. And my reasoning behind it is that when you look back over the defense and what it's been since Mike McDaniel has been there, going through Josh Boyer to Vic Fangio and now to Anthony Weaver, the big piece they went and acquired and the piece they've continued to build around is Jalen Ramsey. My comp for Jahdae Barron in the draft is Jalen Ramsey. These are players that can go out there and they can play boundary cornerbacks and, be effective there. But if you just ask them to play outside, then you're really limiting their effectiveness, different than what you have with a Will Johnson out there. And, Jalen Ramsey is not getting any younger. So my vision here is that you bring Jahdae Barron in. He is your cornerback 2, 3, along with Ramsey and Kohu, able to move around, able to do some of that safety type stuff as well, right? And really probably Ramsey doing more of that stuff here in 2025. But Ramsey's getting up there in age, so by bringing in Barron, you've already got the replacement for Ramsey. And as you move forward in this roster building and you see whether they move on from Ramsey or they, go through Ramsey's retirement, what you have in Barron is the player that can slide directly into that role. And when you lose the player that I think you're kind of building the defense around, at least from a secondary perspective, you have the player that can move into that role and you don't have to reinvent it. You can continue doing the same things that you've been successful with in the years prior. So again, player that I feel can step in that cornerback room with, dipping a toe into the safety room right away. And long term is the player that moves into that Jalen Ramsey role and becomes the focal point of your secondary. All right, as we move on to the next set of picks here, you can obviously see several trades that happened. I wasn't involved in any of those. Looking at some of the names that went after my pick at 13 and before the next pick that we'll talk about at 48, you saw Tyler Warren go in that next pick. You saw Walter Nolan go at 17, which, like I said, I'm looking at defensive tackles. Walter Nolan is not one that I am super high on. So kind of like seeing him go there because I think it pushes some other guys down. Donovan Jackson at 18 was a little bit of a surprise, but one of those guys that I could see stepping in as an immediate player at guard for the Dolphins. Tet McMillan at 22 is a player that I really like. I think 22 is probably low for him, but not. I don't see how he fits into the Dolphins based on what they have in that room and needs they have in other positions. Saw Starks going down to 24, which, like I talked about earlier, I think that's really good value for him. I think he's going to be a top safety in the league. 34, you saw Derek Harmon go, another defensive lineman who I like, and he's kind of shot up draft boards recently. I don't have him this high in the draft. I think he's a good player, but there are defensive tackles that I like better than him. Calvin Banks Jr. at 35. Really good value here. The tackles kind of went in the order that I thought they would for the most part, but I think that Banks lasting till 35 is unlikely. But if he's there, certainly good value. As we got into the 40 range, I kind of had a thought about trading up. I watched Tyler Booker dropping down the draft board, and I think he is the ideal fit for the Dolphins at left guard. I know there are concerns with his athleticism in the wide zone scheme, but I would point to Aaron Banks and Laken Tomlinson as guys that you wouldn't view as, athletic studs that were ideal fits for the 49ers version of the wide zone. And, I really haven't seen a whole lot of clips where people are showing me that Booker doesn't do well in open field. So I think that he'd be a really good fit. Not sure that I would trade up to 40 to get him, but had he fallen a little further, I'd have probably started knocking on some doors to see if I could lock that one in. Travion Henderson at 41. I think he's kind of risen a little bit too. If he was around in round 3, I'd have a hard time passing that up. Don't like him at 41, but I think that he is going to be a stud in a wide zone system. And then Josh Connerly Jr. at 43. Similar to Kelvin Banks, tackles going in kind of the order I expected to. Don't expect Connerly to be there at 43, but if he had been on the board still at 48, probably a player that I would have looked to draft, slide in there at right guard, and to bump James Daniels over to left guard. And then last one before we get to our pick that I want to talk about was Benjamin Morrison, and not a player that I would have drafted with getting Jahdae Barron in round 1. But if we went a different direction in round 1 and Benjamin Morrison was on the board at 48 and the medicals check out, this is, probably one of the few corners that I am confident could step in and be an immediate starter from day one. I think he's being kind of undervalued, maybe just from not having the tape. But this is a really good player that if he does slide this far, could be somebody to look at as a target if they don't go cornerback in round 1. All right, so on the clock at 48, some of the names that I'm looking at here, you got Alfred Collins and Tyleik Williams at defensive tackle. Gray Zabel is still on the board as an interior offensive lineman. You got Mason Taylor as your Y tight end, and then also Jonah Savanaya is a left guard idea. Talking about Williams and Collins, this is kind of the reason that I'm not quite as high on Kenneth Grant being an option at number 13. I think all 3 of those guys, Grant, Williams, and Collins, I see them all pretty close in terms of talent, but they all bring something a little different to the table. Grant, I see as more of your interior type defensive lineman. I think that he's out of the group probably your best 0-1-2 eye technique type player. I view him in the same kind of light that I view Vince Wilfork in terms of, big guy, interior alignments mostly, but high motor, super good athlete considering his size. Alfred Collins, I've seen Kyle Krabs compare him to being Raekwon Davis if Raekwon Davis would play up to his potential. And I see that a lot. Like walking off the bus, like that dude is, built like a god in terms of, what you would picture from a defensive lineman, particularly somebody that could play from a 5 technique down to your 2 technique type player. He does have the ability and the hand fighting ability to play in that 0-1 technique, but I think that his length and his build don't give him a great advantage of the leverage there, but something he can do. Don't feel like he offers as much as a pass rusher. And then Tyleik Williams is, kind of a blend of all of that. I think that he is a better 0-1 technique type player than what Alfred Collins would be, but I feel like he could flex out a little further than what Kenneth Grant can. One of the notes that I have on Tyleik Williams that I feel that he is, very similar to Christian Wilkins in terms of what he can do in his motor, but maybe a little more stout in the run game while still contributing to your pass rush as well. Gray Zabel, probably not going to be here at that point, but still has to be part of the conversation in this draft because he was there. Guy that shot up the draft boards after the Senior Bowl, feels like he's kind of been forgotten there, even though he hasn't done anything bad since then to really, lose that attention. Was able to show out at center, which really isn't that important for the Dolphins, but has that 3 position versatility inside and, could probably kick out to tackle in a pinch as well. So whoever gets him that late is still going to be a good value. Mason Taylor. So Warren and Taylor are the 2 players that I'm confident could step in day one and be immediate upgrades over what is available right now for the Dolphins as that wide tight end type position. But you do have Julian Hill and you have Pharaoh Brown who are likely to be on the roster. So while I do really like Mason Taylor, I think there are still some holes on this roster that, are probably going to take me in a different direction in this draft. And then Jonah Savaiinaea, who I really like. I think that he is one of the top options to be a left guard player for the Dolphins. Maybe not as much position versatility. A guy that could maybe kick out and play a little bit of tackle. Probably very much in the same realm as Larry Borum in terms of player abilities. But I think that he is a day one starter at left guard and gives you some flexibility. All right, so my pick ended up being Tyleik Williams. And the reasoning behind that, when we look at the interior offensive line positions, so Zabel and Savaiinaea, I feel like when you add James Daniels and you bring back Liam Eichenberg, you didn't take a step back in that room. I know that we don't want Liam Eichenberg going in as the starter, right? But you're at least as good as you were last year. And same idea with Mason Taylor in terms of the tight end room, right? You replaced Durham Smythe with Pharaoh Brown and returned everything else. So you're at least a little bit better than what you were in 2024. The defensive tackle room, between not knowing what's going on with Calais Campbell and Deshaun Hand leaving, that room is taking a significant step back. And Tyleik Williams over Alfred Collins for me comes down to the flexibility in terms of alignments, in my opinion. I think that when you're looking at that base package in a 3-4 defense, that if you've got Sealer, Benito Jones, and then you got Tyleik Williams out there as a 5 technique, that's a really strong front. And then in the passing downs is where I would give Williams the nod over Alfred Collins, that I feel you can boot Benito Jones off the field. And when you have Sealer and Williams both pushing the pocket, I think that's going to be a really good combination as well. So in the end, the versatility of Tyleik Williams in both the run and the pass game is why I chose him over Alfred Collins. I do think that Alfred Collins is probably one of the best run stoppers, if not the best interior run stopper in the draft. But for me, Tyleik Williams, versatility, he's the one that got the nod here at pick 48. All right. After we made the pick at 48 was where I, really started to start entertaining the idea of trying to move up from that round three, number 98 pick. There was still a lot of guys on the board that I liked. I had agreed in principle to a trade shortly after pick number 48. Kind of held off on pulling the trigger because I wanted to see how the board continued to fall. Um, you can see that Alfred Collins went a few picks later at 51. You can see that Gray Zabel went off at 54. And this takes you all the way to the end of round three. And the offer that I had was for pick number 72. And, when I'm looking at Mason Taylor and Jonah Savania still being on the board, those are both players that I really liked and were in strong consideration for 48. So at the end of round three was when I made the jump up to 72 with the goal of getting one of those two players. All right, so what we have up now is how round three started. So the trade that I made, originally I wanted to look to use the two compensatory picks. So that was pick 98 and 135. And I wanted to get back up into the low 80s range. But when I, put the message out there that I was looking to move up, I got an offer to move up to pick 72, and the cost was the two compensatory picks, so 98 and 135, plus pick 150 in round five. Now we had two picks in round five, so the idea of throwing in a extra fifth round pick to get 10 picks higher than what I was even looking to do was really intriguing there. So I pulled the trigger on that trade thinking it was a solid case that I would have a chance at Taylor or Savania. And as you can see here, didn't work out that way. Taylor ended up going with the first pick in the third round at number 65. And then Savania went four picks ahead of where I was picking at pick number 78. So as we got to pick 72, right, didn't have the targets on the board that we were going to, so kind of went to more of a best player available type approach. And as I kind of worked through the list, the four players that kind of stood out to me for BPA were Marcus Mbow, Ariante Ursary, Danny Stutzman, and Quandarius Robinson. And Mbow is a player I really like his athletic ability. Definitely an explosive player when it comes to being a lineman. Not somebody that I'm completely confident can play tackle early in his career in the NFL. Ariante Ursary, to be completely honest, is not a player that I've looked at closely. Probably need to do more in that, but it seems to be a player that a lot of Dolphins fans are very high on. When I look at his measurables, I've talked before about the type of mold that the Shanahan or McDaniel type schemes are looking at, and Ursary fits very much into that mold. The only thing that's even questionable is his three-cone drill, which was 7.81, which is just barely off of the low mark by Jalen Moore of 7.77. So I think he's still very much in that mold. Danny Stutzman is an off-ball linebacker that I am very high on. But in terms of fits with the Dolphins, we looked at that room, the guy, bringing back Terrell Dodson and then adding in Britt and Gay, right? Not a ton of room there for another off-ball linebacker, but still a player that I like a lot and got consideration here. And then Quandarius Robinson is more of a hybrid linebacker. He's a guy that can play off ball. He's a guy that can move up to the edge and rush the passer from there as well. But again, two rooms that when we look at what they have in the off-ball linebacker room and what is coming back at the edge group, just there's not a lot of reps there. So those are the players that I was looking at in terms of best player ability. Kind of reached out via Twitter, texted a few people, and just got their thoughts on what they would do in that position. All right, so in the end, kind of joked on Twitter that I consulted my scouting department, and Ursary ended up being the pick. Um, like I said, wasn't thrilled about the snap counts available for Stutzman or Robinson. Mbao, while I like him and I like his upside as a guard, not as thrilled about his upside as a tackle early in his career. Ursary, gotta watch more on him, and that's why I joked that I, leaned on my scouting team because I don't know a ton about him. But I know a lot of guys that I respect are high on him. And when I look at his measurables, maybe he's a little bit tall for what you'd want at guard at 6'6", but at 331 pounds, you know, probably has some potential at maybe competing at left guard. And the worst case scenario, in my opinion, is that he steps in and is that swing tackle. Sure, I'd love to have a veteran guy, but this at least gives you somebody else to compete with Keon Smith. And in this position in the draft, with the guys that I really wanted not being available, didn't want to go and reach on a player lower on my board. So while Ursary was not a player that I was, you know, actively looking to get, he's still a player that was a great value at pick number 72. And, one of the things that I said looking at the roster construction from the beginning is that I don't feel like you can ever have enough tackles on the roster, right? If Ursary comes in and he is a guy that you can't keep off the field, but he's not a guard, right? You could take Austin Jackson and kick him inside. Or maybe you develop him and it gives you a runway to move off of Austin Jackson in a couple of years. So, just kind of the approach of if players are going off the board that you really like, not trying to reach for another position of need, but really trying to go for a best player available at a high value position. All right, so just gonna kind of check in here. So we reached the end of round 3 in this mock draft. I did go back and watch some more on Ursary, and I'm really encouraged by that pick. I see a lot of similarities with Patrick Paul in terms of the things that he does well and some of the limitations. I don't really see him as a great fit to guard, but again, like I said before, if you have 4 offensive tackles and you need a guard, you can figure out a way to make that work. I like the upside there. Still happy with taking the best player available approach on that. So as we look through some of the other names that have gone here throughout the third round, you have Arroyo going at pick 73. Mbao was one we talked about at 72. He went at 81. Gunnar Helm is a tight end that I like. Reminds me a lot of a Sam Laporta. A lot of the same notes that I had on him. Picked at 82. Jordan Phillips intrigued me a little bit. Probably not in round 3. Ferguson, similar to Arroyo, is another one of those F-type tight ends, along with Fannin, that could have been in the conversation had any of those guys continued to fall. You had some more tackles in Deion Walker and or Omar Norman Lott. Safety that a lot of Dolphins fans like in Makuba going at 95. Miami's own Damian Martinez going at 97. Giddens, another pretty good running back, going here at 99. And then, probably the one that hurt the most in round 3 was CJ West for me. I think that he's a player that I would have liked to pick up to compete with Benito Jones that I think could have contributed early in on passing downs from a 0 and 1 technique player. Looking over, obviously I haven't scouted every player that's left, so there's going to be guys that are kind of left off here, but we're going into day 3 of the draft and wanted to talk about a few of the players that are still on the board that kind of intrigue me as we go along. At running back, Bashal Tutin is probably, one of my top options with what I talked about earlier with the running backs that can replace what Devon Achane does. I expect him to go fairly soon coming up. Not sure if he'll make it to our fourth round pick or not. If he does, he'll be in strong consideration there. Trevor Etienne, probably a little further down, is another player that I think can do some of the same things. Wide receiver, didn't look a lot at wide receivers this year. One guy that we talked about on Scouting the Fins that's still available. Again, later than just, not an early day three guy, but Chimere DK is a player that I think would be a good addition to the wide receiver room. Tight ends, not a whole lot here left in terms of guys that I think would improve the team. Gavin Bartholomew is one that I liked early on in the process, and he's kind of fallen off. If he's there in the seventh round, probably something I'm going to look at. Tackles that are left, there's still some good options here. I'd be hesitant to go there with already getting Ursary. Looking at guards, so the one that really sticks out to me is a guy that I think could still step in and really compete to be a starting left guard in this offense, and that's going to be Miles Frazier. If he's there at our pick in the fourth round, another one that's going to be pretty tough to pass up there. Center's not really looking at anything at this point. So, like I said, defensive tackle, CJ West would have been one that I strongly considered. Another guy that I really like that, when you consider the room that we have now, considering this draft, having Sealer, having Benito Jones, and having Tyleik Williams, I think that Savion Jones is a good player that could, play on the edge in early downs and bump inside on passing downs. I still really like him, and he's going to be in consideration in that fourth round pick if he's there. Looking at edge players, there's a couple of guys that I kind of like, but they'd have to fall a bit further to really get into that conversation. Linebacker, so we still have Stutzman and Quandarius Robinson on the board, and those are guys that were in the conversation for that pick at 72. So going to be interested to see if they go in these next few picks before we're on the clock again, but they'll obviously get some consideration as well. Corners, Jabbar Muhammad is another guy that I really liked, and he's been kind of undervalued in my opinion. Would like to see him continue to fall and have a chance at that. And then safeties don't really have a whole lot here. Most of the guys that I looked at that are still on the board are guys that I see more in that deep center fielder type role. And I think that between Patrick McMorris and Ashton Davis, I think, are two guys that I see fitting that role on the roster already, and adding more of those is just kind of, not really adding anything to the roster. So I'll be surprised if there's a safety that really, wets my whistle on there. But again, just wanted to check in here, end of the third round, and we'll be back again for the fourth round. All right, so we are at the Dolphins pick of the fourth round, pick 116. But before we talk about who I selected for the Dolphins, let's take a quick look at the other players that went off the board prior to this pick. So Danny Stutzman was one that we talked about as being one of my targets, ended up going in the fourth round with the fifth pick of that round. Billy Bowman is another player that a lot of Dolphins fans are high, but like I talked about earlier, in terms of the style of safety that he is, I think that's kind of redundant to what the Dolphins have right now. Then we saw another offensive lineman going off the board just before the Dolphins pick. All right, so here's the pick, and that's LSU defensive lineman Savion Jones. And first, let's talk about the alternative. Miles Frazier probably would have been the pick if Jones was unavailable. But part of the reason that I went with Jones over Frazier is that if you look at the current makeup of the offensive line room, even if Teron Armstead moves on, you have guys, whether it's Ursary, who we drafted earlier, Eichenberg, who started last year, Borum is a newcomer, Keon Smith returning from injury. There are options to compete at that left guard position, even though I think that Frazier would be a strong candidate in there. But when you look at the defensive line room that had Zach Sealer, Benito Jones, and now we added Tyleek Williams, there's really nobody else there that can take snaps. The other side of it is if we were to go with Frazier and he doesn't win a starting spot, then he probably doesn't play all year. Whereas with a player like Savion Jones as a defensive lineman, there are opportunities to rotate there, right? Even if he's not a starter, which I wouldn't expect him to be in this scenario. I view Jones as more of a defensive lineman than the edge that he's listed at. I think that on early downs, he can line up as like a five technique defensive end in this 3-4 scheme, right? Either spelling Tyleek Williams or Zach Sealer. And then when we get into the pass rush situations, a guy that we can take Benito Jones off the field and pair with Tyleek Williams or Zach Sealer in that 4-2-5 alignment, and he can really get after it from the interior of the defensive line. And we really saw that at the Senior Bowl. And the other part of it is that Savion Jones was basically the last defensive lineman that I had on my board that I really felt that way about, that he could really rotate in, give good snaps, and play starting snaps if he needs to. Whereas with the offensive line, even after Miles Frazier, I still have some good names on my list. I'd be surprised if we make it through the rest of the draft without another offensive lineman. But those were the two players that my decision came down to, and in the end, it was Savion Jones, in big part due to a supply and demand issue, and just the number of snaps that I'm confident that Jones can play from day one, compared to what Frazier would have to go through in terms of a competition to make it on the field. All right, so we're looking at the rest of round 4 here. And the reason we're kind of stopping it here in terms of this video is just to look at 135 was a pick that we had traded earlier. You can see that Miles Frazier has not been taken at this point. Bashal Tutin is also another favorite of mine in this draft, and getting down into low round 4, high round 5 is where I felt would be really good value for him. There was an opportunity to come up from 155 up to 137, but it would have cost me 155, and I forget what those one or two of the 7th round picks. And in the end, I decided not to do that. One, I'd given up 2 of our 10 picks earlier in the trade up that eventually got Ursary, and 2, it would have created a massive gap in picks between 137 and 224. So in the end, I decided not to make that trade, and as we're going to see soon, kind of regretted that one. All right, so here's the start of round 5. And had I traded up to 137, I really do think that my pick would have been Bashal Tutin, mainly based on the idea that that room is more incomplete than what the offensive line room is currently. So kind of regretting not going up for that, but I still felt okay because I did really like Frazier, and he was still on the board as well. But as we go down through here, you can see that in what was a pick that we actually originally had at pick 150, Miles Frazier went off the board. Frazier was a player that didn't think he was a guarantee to step in at left guard, but certainly felt like he could be part of that competition, right, and maybe come out on top. But didn't work out that way. I think there are still going to be some more opportunities for offensive linemen. I'm not going to do that here with the 5th round pick, but anybody else that we're looking at, I think, is strictly depth and development type stuff. And then you can see on the next picks, another player that I'd probably would have considered was Jackson Slater, who we had interviewed on Scouting the Fins. Went with the next pick there, and then Luke Kandra, another offensive lineman. So bit of a interior offensive line run right before our pick at 155. So with the board not falling exactly like I wanted to, didn't want to go and reach for an offensive lineman in this spot. So decided to go with the top cornerback that was left on my board, and that is Jabbar Muhammad out of Oregon. He's a player that played more on the boundary with Oregon, but I think that he has the quickness to be able to play in the slot as well. Not a guy that I am confident in, is penciling in as a starter. Thankfully, I don't think that's going to be necessary if it were to go this way because we'd have Jahdae Barron and more of a development piece here. But I think there's a lot of upside here. I think that he, brings some good stuff to the defense. And kind of like I talked about at the top of the draft, when it comes to both offensive tackles and cornerbacks, I never feel like you can really have enough of those. And I think when we get to the end of this video and kind of look at the roster construction, I think you'll see where there's still room in that cornerback room to add a player like Muhammad. All right, we're going to break this video into two parts. One reason is that we're closing in on an hour on this video. We also don't have any other picks scheduled until the seventh round, where we have three of them. Um, have an opportunity to possibly trade back up into the sixth, depending on who's available. I'm not sure there's anybody that really excites me that much to give up two seventh round picks to get back up to 85, but we'll take a look at that as we get closer to it. The other reason I want to split this into two parts is that I don't only want to look at the guys I'm drafting in this mock draft, but I also want to circle back to the roster that we looked at to start this video and just kind of look at how these guys fit into that roster and how it kind of helps to fill out those rooms. But for the picks that we've made so far, first round, our original pick number 13 went with Jahdae Barron. Round two, again, original pick number 48 went with Tyleik Williams. Round three, we moved up. Didn't have some of the targets that we wanted, so went best player available at a premium position and ended up with Ariante Ursary. Round four, pick 116 overall. Went D-line again with Savion Jones. And then had opportunities to trade up from 155, decided not to do it. Saw some of the guys that we really like go off the board ahead of this. And similar to the Ursary pick, decided to go best player available on my board at a premium position in Jabbar Muhammad. So thanks for watching. Stay tuned for part two.